A very good evening to you. Welcome to another Newsmaker Live broadcast right here on DBS Television. My name is Timothy Poleon. We'll be together until 10 o'clock this evening, at which time we'll be concluding with the clip that peaked. Well, we do not have any other choice but to focus on what has happened since we last met on this broadcast last Wednesday. Last Wednesday, we were focusing on the crime situation in St. Lucia, and before that, we had the Director General of the OECS Commission focusing on the impact of the hurricane on islands in the northern part of the Caribbean. And that hurricane would have been Irma, only to realize that we'll be facing yet another massive storm. And this time, Dominica was the island that was severely impacted, and St. Lucia is playing a role in terms of assisting in the rehabilitation effort. We're still not very clear as to the magnitude of the impact of that hurricane on the Nature Isle, but we have heard so far there's been at least 7 lives lost as a result of that Category 5 storm, and the damage untold, yet to be quantified in terms of the financial cost. My guest this evening is St. Lucia's acting Prime Minister, Mr. Leonard Montoute. He would have been in the chair at the time that we were bracing ourselves for Hurricane Maria. Welcome to the program.
Thank you, Tim. Good evening to you and your viewers.
Tell me about the experience serving as acting Prime Minister with a storm approaching the island, and you have been there before on several occasions.
Yes. Well, I must say it's not the most comfortable situation. I mean, it is very nerve-wracking. I mean, not knowing what to anticipate. Well, when I say not knowing what to anticipate, not knowing exactly what to expect. You can anticipate, but you're not sure because, I mean, you talk about the weather being unpredictable, and we have seen demonstrations of that in recent time, how unpredictable the weather can be, and we now have, you know, incidents of very intense weather systems, those hurricanes with like Category 5 winds up to over 160 miles per hour and so on. I mean, with this kind of intensity we have not seen in the past, well, we have not seen very often in the past, but now seem to be a regular occurrence. And so, you know, it can be a little frightening when you consider what can possibly happen.
What prompted you to take that drastic decision, if you want to call it that, on a Sunday afternoon to announce that classes, there will not be any school on Monday of this week, and also there will be a shutdown as far as business is concerned and the operations of the government?
Well, first and foremost, the rule of thumb is err on the side of caution. I mean, considering that while we were not going to be directly impacted, we knew that we were going to feel the effects up to tropical storm force winds. There was a tropical storm warning, and the standard protocol for situations like this is to take such action. I wanted to be sure that, you know, we were safe rather than be sorry after the fact. And of course, there's no telling what exactly will happen, but you'd rather take the blame for perhaps making a wrong decision in the direction of being too safe. But at the same time, I mean, you have to take into account the impact a shutdown has on our economy, the negative impact it has for the individual business person, and it is not a decision that you take very lightly. However, sometimes it is just inevitable, unavoidable. You have to take that decision, and that is why you found me, you know, even before the all clear was given, in anticipation of the all clear being given before 10, I on Monday night declared that while we would not have the resumption of school, that we would reopen business on Tuesday. I know that too didn't go down well with some people because the contention was that there was not an all clear and that there was, you know, a call for reopening. But again, like I said, I took into consideration all the information that I had at hand. I had spoken with the Met Office, I had spoken with NEMO, and while NEMO and the Met Office have their standard protocol, and they only make their announcement when they deem it absolutely clear. I having discussions with them, I was reasonably certain that we would have had an all clear before 10. However, I gave the proviso that there would be an assessment made at 8 o'clock, And if by then we realize that what we anticipated was not the case, then I would have made a further announcement. That was not necessary, and so at 9 the all clear came, and of course we were ready, set to go for 10 o'clock. I mean, in retrospect, I think it was the right decision. Of course, you can't please everyone, but I'm satisfied that I made the right call.
You ever take into consideration what the armchair meteorologists will have to say, those people who pretend to be meteorologists, those people who pay particular attention to the weather, will chart it and so on, and then they say that, you know, probably the Met Office was lagging, was a bit tardy in terms of making decisions and issuing reports in a timely manner?
Well, I mean, this is not the first time I've had reason to work with Met Services, and I will tell you, I have confidence in them. I'm satisfied that they are very professional and that they are extremely cautious, and that to me is important, and that is why I have confidence in the information that they provide me. And so I cannot go by, you know, the naysayers or the speculators. I have to go by what the professionals say. And of course, quite apart from the information that I get from the Met Services, I also have discussions with NEMO. That is the agency that is responsible for disasters in our country. And with them, I come up with my decision.
Do you think it's time that we have the Met Office in St. Lucia enter into some kind of collaborative effort with the likes of Martinique and Guadeloupe, where I understand they have a radar system?
Well, they are in collaboration with those countries. They do collaborate, and they get quite a lot of assistance from those countries. And so when they provide information, it is information that has been verified and that is corroborated by our sister islands.
Do you find yourself in a difficulty when you make a decision with regard to whether to have announce a shutdown or not, to take into consideration the feelings of the employer versus that of workers?
Well, I have to take all concerns into consideration, and I have to tell you, first and foremost, I'm concerned about the negative impact it has on our economy generally. I also take into consideration, you know, the consequences for individual business people. Of course, to a lesser extent, I must tell you, to a lesser extent, if a worker just wants a holiday and doesn't want me to call a shutdown just because he doesn't want to report to work, I do not give much regard to that.
But in the final analysis, don't you think that definitely there is need for, whenever there's an announcement, that for those people, whether it's the employee or the employer, to adhere to those in the case of a shutdown, because you still saw many people lingering around the Castries market area. Some businesses also were opened, and that certainly would have been of tremendous concern to the authorities.
Well, most definitely, because the weather pattern can change in a moment's notice, or without a moment's notice, rather. And if that happens, I mean, you could have drastic consequences. And at the end of the day, our primary concern is to avoid casualty and loss of damage to property. And when people ignore the warnings, I think they are taking a risk. And, you know, they would do well to desist from that practice, because, yes, at times it turns out that they took a chance and it worked out, but just consider the contrary. What would happen if, you know, things had turned out to be the worst?
As a senior government minister and minister with responsibility for equity, social justice and empowerment, do you think that there's need to take some drastic decision as far as ensuring that people adhere to a shutdown?
Well, yes,
do you think we should legalize it? Have it legislated instead of legislated.
Yeah, well, it's a shame that you would have to do so for people to comply, but I believe it's necessary, because the reason why I'm saying so, it is because, I mean, at the end of the day, when people do not adhere to those warnings and they find themselves in difficulty, then what do? They turn around and call the emergency services, and at that time, they're expected for those people to put themselves and their lives at risk. And very often too, if you open and so on, then you encourage customers to come to your place of business, as opposed to if there was no business in operation, they would not be tempted to go out. I think you're compounding the situation by doing so. I would certainly, personally, I would certainly support drastic measures to be taken against those who do not adhere and comply.
But you're making a point now. But 2 months from now, when the hurricane season ends, after November the 30th, I think you would have forgotten about it. The rest of St. Lucia would have forgotten about this. And we'll be having that same discussion, God spare our lives, next year.
You have a point, Tim, but I think the time has come for us to take this thing more seriously and, give more considered regard to, the measures that ought to be taken. I'm thinking not only in terms of strengthening legislation, but also in terms of the preparation we make for such occurrences, preparation from the point of view of preparing for a disaster, like to help mitigate the impact of the disaster. And even beyond that, we need to consider ourselves to be vulnerable. We are. And to look at our building code, to look at the standards, of operation and the practices that we engage in. And apart from the building code, when I talk about, other considerations, for instance, we talk about shelters. And should we be struck by a hurricane that is devastating and homes are destroyed, it is expected that people will leave their dwelling place and go to those shelters. How structurally safe are those shelters? How adequate are those shelters? And when I say adequate, if you're going to designate a building as a shelter, shouldn't there be a cistern at that building, knowing that normally when we have such disasters, our water system, our mains are knocked out? Shouldn't you have generators at those shelters, considering that it's very likely that electricity will be knocked out and probably for a while? Those are the obvious common sense considerations that we should be taking, and to put those measures in place, put things in place for that purpose.
Are those structures just shelters in name only? For example, you have schools. Those schools are in need of repair, but they are designated shelters.
Well, I know that the Ministry of Infrastructure inspect those buildings and so on, but I do not know how, and I do not know the regularity with which that is done. And that is something we must consider, because even during the storm, I was getting reports of designated shelters that were not fit to be shelters. And we have to be careful about things like this, because, the state would be liable if you are asking people to go to a shelter that is not structurally safe and so on. And besides, if we're looking at mitigating, the impact of, for example, hurricanes, we ought to know that those buildings can withstand, a certain force winds and is, safe against other aspects of the weather, like rain and so on, that is not in a flood-prone area and not susceptible to landslides and all of those things we have to take into consideration. Because by asking someone to go to that shelter, you're saying to that person, go to safety. And so I think we have to take it a lot more seriously, and even begin to perhaps retrofit our shelters, those that already exist, to ensure that they meet the standards that are required. And as we go forward, for example, in my constituency of Grosile, we are building a human resource center, one of the biggest buildings in Grosile. I think it would have been prudent, it would have been wise for us to consider, even beforehand, and that building, while its primary purpose is to serve as a human resource center, that it could serve as a shelter and look at the necessaries. Because originally there was a cistern in the plan that was removed. Okay? There's no plan for a backup generator, and, well, I can't speak to the structural soundness of the building. It appears to be, to me. But I'm saying, as we go forward, we're already expending the resources, so let us ensure that, we maximize the resources so that that building can also double up as a shelter. And that is all I'm saying. We can do a lot better than we are doing right now.
What does the government of Prime Minister Alan Chastanet plan to do in that regard, in addressing the issue? I know that apart from being Prime Minister, he's also the Minister of Finance. But from your perspective, what would you want the government to do? What role would you play in terms of influencing the decision of the government in ensuring that those shelters are adequate?
Well, fortunately, we have already begun the discussion on certain measures to be taken, because we recognize, whether you like it or not, I mean, you have to expend resources for such purposes. You either do before or after. Now, you're better off if you know, it'll be cheaper for you to do it before, to minimize the impact of the storms, as opposed to after the fact, when you have the widespread devastation, you even have casualties and so on. I think it's cheaper. It's an inevitable expense that we have to go through. We need to begin to adapt and to begin to prepare and plan for those occurrences, because they seem to be almost frequent and inevitable nowadays.
With regard to adhering to the building codes, the big issue for many people who plan to construct their homes anytime soon would be the added cost. What do you say to those people? Apart from having the insurance, that have to build their homes to withstand a certain force winds. Now we're looking at 160 miles per hour. People already who are barely earning enough money, I mean, to feed themselves and so on, who are sufficiently, I imagine that they want to go the extra mile, to take the extra effort to construct their homes and so on. That certainly will come at an additional cost. How will they meet the cost of that?
Well, Tim, I'm sympathetic and sensitive to that situation. However, what you have to take into consideration is having to rebuild altogether because your structure wasn't sufficiently sound. I mean, we may have to take a number of things into consideration, whether you're going to minimize or reduce on the size to increase the soundness of your structure or what have you. In some cases, it is not even much additional cost that is involved. I believe, quite apart from, improving the structure through additional devices that you use and equipment that you use, there is design as well. Because I remember as a boy, during Hurricane Allen, we saw many old buildings with those high-pitched roofs, the French colonial type of structure, withstanding the winds, while many new buildings with those flat roofs, the roofs were blown away. And so, I'm not an engineer, but I heard the discussion at the time that it was because of the design of the roof. So we need to even look at design as well. How we design our structures, what materials we use, and all of that, to ensure that our buildings are stronger. Do you even use hurricane straps? How expensive are those straps? These are simple things that could be done to improve and enhance the strength and the soundness of your structure.
But generally, with regard to housing, what role does government plan to play in terms of ensuring that people have proper housing? There are some people consider them poor and indigent, but you must provide them with housing.
Yeah.
And in some cases, very often, they cannot provide it for themselves. What role does the government plan to play in that regard?
Well, I think we have to reconsider the role that we have been playing. You have the Ministry of Housing Development Corporation, who engage in housing, in providing houses for people. They, I would expect, would observe and adhere to the code and the building standards. They are subsidized housing, and even if it is subsidized, I'm hoping that we will not compromise when it comes to the standard. And even the poor people, people who are indigent, that we assist with housing, normally what we do is build a little plywood shelter for them. I think we have to revisit that, and I am not necessarily trying to advocate what material it has to be, but to ensure that while it may be low cost, we do not compromise when it comes to the soundness of the structure.
Those initiatives would come at a huge cost to the government of St. Lucia, or any government at all. In the case of Barbuda, that island was devastated, and therefore it's about 1,800 inhabitants. They have been evacuated. Right. The Prime Minister, Mr. Gaston Brown, said that it could take a little over $200 million US to reconstruct and so on. What kind of assistance are you looking forward to the region getting from the likes of the donor agencies and friendly countries and so on? Do you think we are more likely to get assistance in the aftermath of the passage of those storms in the Caribbean?
We will get assistance. Unfortunately, I mean, there's so many incidents around the world, so many places crying out for assistance around the world. I mean, you just had the earthquake in Mexico, for instance. I mean, so Mexico is one of the countries who lend a helping hand. They have their own crisis. I mean, there are other crises throughout the world, some man-made. For example, in Venezuela, they are providing assistance, but they have their own problems in their country. And, you know, the United States of America have their own issues with hurricanes as well. And so we have recognized that, you know, we cannot sit by and depend on foreign aid to bail us out of our situation entirely. We welcome all and every assistance that we receive, but we have to see what we could do for ourselves. We as a region have to band together and assist one another. We as a region have to plan to see what we can do for ourselves in terms of mitigation, in terms of response, in terms of relief as far as these things are concerned. Because, I mean, you have the dependent territories like Virgin Islands, the US and British Virgin Islands. You have Martinique, for instance, and Guadeloupe that are struck. And in those cases, we're hoping that the mother country would, you know, come to their rescue and provide significant assistance. However, I have to say that there are some regional countries that we must tip our hats to, such as Venezuela. Venezuela was very quick to respond to Dominica's situation. I mean, as you would be aware, operations are being coordinated and organized here in St. Lucia for Dominica. They have sent military planes, they have sent helicopters, they have sent personnel. Cuba, who was hit just a week ago, or just about a week ago by Irma, are sending personnel, are sending supplies, and so on. So we have to, you know, tip our hats to our sister countries in the region, Latin America and the Caribbean, for their swift response and their willingness to assist.
How do you react to the possibility? We don't even want that to be part of the discussion per se, but we cannot avoid it. The possibility of St. Lucia having to be evacuated. What are your thoughts?
Oh, that's a nightmare you're talking about there. I mean, first of all, evacuated to where? Very often, if it is a large system, St. Vincent and Martinique would be impacted if we are affected here. And do our sister islands have the capacity to deal with evacuees from our country on a large scale? I mean, when you look at it to a very great extent, it is a question of seeing what you could do at home to deal with your crisis, to deal with your situation. So we have to build like in-house capacity, so to speak, while we look to assist each other. I think the reality is, you know, and look at the case of St. Lucia, just as Dominica. Some of the flatter countries, I mean, were flattened by the wind, yes, but they do deal with some flooding, some high winds and so on. But we have the additional peril of landslides in countries like St. Lucia and Dominica. And of course, you know, during Thomas, the main culprit in terms of the disaster and the loss of life was landslide. Now, even that calls into question some of our practices as well. Deforestation, for instance, you know. I mean, if there is a widespread deforestation, there's a greater likelihood that we can, you know, that there could be slippage on our slopes in this country. So all of those things have to be taken into consideration. I think a real serious education drive has to be undertaken, real legislation, if necessary, strengthened to control those practices, and for our people and us as a government to engage in activities that would, you know, mitigate and minimize, you know, occurrences, you know, such as landslides. And when I say mitigate and minimize it, I talk about reforestation. You know, we sometimes talk about beautification programs and so on, but I think the money will be well spent or better spent if you talk about planting on river edges, planting on slopes, planting trees on slopes and so on. You have countries engaging in exercises and saying, well, they're planting 1 million trees and so on. These are not just futile activities. These are, I mean, quite apart from the environment, it is enriching to the environment, given the fact that you get more oxygen from trees. It helps to keep your soil together. It, and helps your water source and all of those things. So these are all things that we have to seriously look at from now on. It is a real comprehensive approach that we must take in terms of Ministry of Agriculture, Ministry of Education, infrastructure, you name it. We all have to come together to ensure, and even at the community level, community development and so on, we have to look at, all the measures that are necessary, our habits, in terms of cleanliness. I mean, you look at, just think about it. You go to the mouths of our rivers, our oceans and so on at the end of a storm, and you see all the debris. You look at our drains, some of them are clogged because of the plastic bottles and all the garbage that we indiscriminately dispose of. All of those things we have to take more seriously because they can have dire consequences for us. That's
one of the initiatives that you think we cannot put on the back burner, because we are well known for, putting things on the back burner, pigeonholing certain recommendations and not implementing them.
Well, you see, I think the time has come where we have to recognize and understand that we can't just continue to say that we are blessed and we'll be spared and count on our luck. I mean, God has spared us, the worst, but we cannot continue to say that it will always be the case. We have to prepare for the worst. And preparing for the worst means that we cannot, after 9 days, forget about the discussion that we are having here now, that we have to ensure that we, even during off-season, we do what is necessary to take care of the possibilities that exist during this inevitable season.
You're watching Newsmaker Live right here on DBS Television with me, Timothy Poleon, and my guest, Acting Prime Minister Mr. Leonard Montour, is also the MP for Grosile and the Minister with responsibility for equity, social justice and empowerment. Back in a moment.